podcast. Welcome back. I'm excited to dig into episode 2 of this still brand new fantasy football podcast, focusing specifically on rookies and how we can evaluate them through the fantasy football process. My name is Matt Hicks at the FF_educator and director of fantasy football for the NFL Draft Bible. On today's podcast episode, we're going to be breaking down the players with the most to gain and lose at the 2021 Reese's Senior Bowl. Now, whether you're very familiar with the Senior Bowl or this is the first time you're hearing about the event, I think this is going to be a really informative podcast episode for you. I'm going to pick 10 of the players that I think have the most to gain or lose after Senior Bowl week. Now, if you're not familiar with the format of this podcast, what I do is each week I build a big board based on a unique topic that provides insight on my process of evaluating the 2021 NFL draft class, specifically analyzing their value when it comes to fantasy football. Now, this is a brand new podcast. I mentioned that off the bat. This is only episode 2, so I really need your help in growing it. So if you could please take 2 seconds and subscribe to the podcast, whether you're listening on Apple Podcasts, whether you're listening on Spotify, whether you're listening or watching on YouTube. By the way, a big graphics upgrade here for episode 2 on YouTube. So if you're watching, I really appreciate that as well. Rookie Big Board Podcast is the name on all of those providers. I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe, leave a 5-star review, especially on Apple Podcasts. The thumbs up on YouTube, that like, I really appreciate all of that. It's super helpful in me growing this podcast. And I have to say, I'm overwhelmed with the amount of listens and watches from the first episode. I really am. It has exceeded my expectations. I really appreciate the support. I want to keep this momentum going. And I read some of the reviews that y'all left on Apple Podcasts that is so helpful for me. And I'm going to start reading some of those reviews on future episodes because they are honestly so wonderful. I really appreciate that. Each episode, we start with a question from a patron. This podcast is powered by my Patreon, patreon.com/theffelducator. And so each show, I start with a question submitted via the Slack. If you're interested in getting involved, joining that community, you can sign up at patreon.com/theffelducator. For just $1 a month, you join the Slack and you get the bonus episode of this podcast. I'll talk about that here in a second. And for $3 a month, you gain access to the Rookie Big Board itself, where I have over 169 prospects ranked with tape evaluations. I'm adding to that daily. I've watched a lot of tape this week, adding a lot of players, taking some players away too as they decide that they want to return to college. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and let's jump into a question here from Justin Leland. Justin, by the way, a new patron. Really appreciate it, Justin. Appreciate that support. He asked, how could the Senior Bowl coaching staffs affect where players come off the board? And that's a very good question. So for those not familiar, the way it works is that the two teams, I want to say the two worst teams, but that's not exactly the best wording. It's based on reverse draft order, right? Or reverse performance. So we go down the list here with how the order that teams are picking it. That's probably the best way to say it. Now, it's not necessarily going to be the top 2 teams because what they do is they eliminate coaching staffs that are new. So it's only returning coaching staffs. So it's the NFL draft order, and then it's the first 2 coaching staffs are invited to coach based on not having serious turnover. So I know that's a little confusing. And so this year it's Brian Flores and the Miami Dolphins coaching staff. Remember, that's not actually their pick. That's traded from Houston. But this year, the Senior Bowl gave that to Miami because that is the draft order. They earned that pick by trading for it. And Matt Rule and the Carolina Panthers. Now, these are 2 really interesting coaching staffs. And so some years, the coaching staff, I think, affects things a little bit more. Some years it doesn't. But here's how I could see the coaching staffs affecting things this year. And let's break them down a little bit individually. I think the Panthers one is really fun. First off, just fun, right? Because Matt Rule, remember, he's only coached 1 year in Carolina. He's rebuilding this program. He's doing it with his guys. We saw that guys like Robbie Anderson being added in. But also, Rule is only a year removed from the college ranks. Remember, he was coaching at Baylor just 2 years ago, a little over a year ago, I should say. And before that, he had a long stint at Temple. So Rule is a college guy. He understands the way that these prospects think and the way that they're coming out. So I think he is going to have a really unique approach. Now, looking at what the Panthers might be looking for, specifically trying to focus in here on fantasy football impact, the Panthers really could affect the way the quarterback situation comes off the board. Panthers, I believe, are picking at 6. That's a really interesting spot because they could still be engaged in the quarterback discussion. Maybe one of those top 4 guys, right? Justin Fields, Trevor Lawrence, Trey Lance, Zach Wilson. That's not in any particular order. Now, none of those guys are at the Senior Bowl. So it could be interesting to see if the Panthers fall in love with one of these other quarterbacks that are at the Senior Bowl, and we're going to talk about them. So I'm not going to dig into them yet, but I'm wondering if, maybe they fall in love with one of those guys. But also, they're going to be looking for a day 2 running back to pair up with CMC. I know we kind of cringe for that for fantasy football purposes, but let's be honest, they're going to be looking for a day 2 quarterback to pair up with CMC because they got to start splitting that workload with him, right? And we saw that with Mike Davis. We saw the potential. So when we talk about some of these running backs that we're going to talk about, keep an eye or an ear out for Carolina because that might be a potential fit for some of these guys that I'm projecting out for day 2. By the way, being a day 2 running back is nothing to shake your head at. One more thought here. It has not worked out with Ian Thomas at the tight end position for Carolina. Carolina definitely could be looking at some of these tight ends. And tight ends gain a lot of momentum at the Senior Bowl because they're players that can be difficult to evaluate on their college teams because they're used in a variety of different ways. Now let's flip the script here, talk a little bit about the way the Dolphins might be able to affect it. Now this is a big score, I think, for Miami. This is a big, big bump for them because they're a team that's building really from the inside out. They ripped down that whole roster and they found some quick success, getting 10 wins this season. As we know, they didn't make the playoffs. It isn't enough. It's a tough division, tough conference. So what could they be looking for? And we're going to take a quick pivot outside of fantasy football here in a second. But first, with a fantasy football perspective, I'd say they definitely could be looking at a running back, a day 2 type guy if they don't want to spend their early draft capital on Najee Harris or Travis Etienne, which some have suggested. But if they'd rather wait, or quite frankly, they might end up drafting 2 running backs. But they're also a team that really needs wide receivers. And I think wide receivers specifically are a position that are able to really increase their stock. Remember Denzel Mims? We were not talking about Denzel Mims before the Senior Bowl last year. And the reason the Senior Bowl helps wide receivers is because there's a lot of focus on isolation drills. Now, the practices leading up to the Senior Bowl game are actually the biggest deal. And I'm going to break down the Senior Bowl a little bit more here in a second. But for those not familiar, there's a lot of practice days. And the isolation type drills really help coaches hone in on the skills and the raw talent that wide receivers come with, or all players come with. But those wide receiver drills against corners, that really helps prospects show out. And so we're going to talk about some wide receivers that I think could really improve their draft stock. And I think Miami's going to be honed in on that. Now, I'm just going to take a quick pivot and just point out that it's a really good lineman class that's going there. And I think Miami is in desperate need of some linemen. So outside of the fantasy football world for a second here, Trey Smith, Dylan Radins out of small school, I believe it's North Dakota State, and Spencer Brown out of Northern Iowa. Those guys I would pay attention to. Also, Alex Leatherwood out of Alabama announced just today on Thursday that he will be going to the Senior Bowl as well. So there's a lot of talent there at the offensive line position, and I think Miami especially could be honing in on some of those guys. So maybe some of those linemen will go higher in the draft than we originally expected as well. So there you go, Justin. That's how I think the Senior Bowl coaching staffs could affect draft risers and fallers. Again, you can go ahead and subscribe. Just $3 a month. Just literally $3 a month gets you access to the bonus episodes, the Slack channel, and the Rookie Big Board itself. I'm trying to bring more people into this, and I'm just trying to, keep enough to keep the software running and keep everything going on the back end, justify the time that I put into this. So I really appreciate your support in any way that may come, and I will continue starting off all of these episodes with that. Now, let's go ahead and let's transition into building the big board. Before we do that, though, I just want to throw out some quick background knowledge on the Senior Bowl. If you're not familiar with the Senior Bowl, there's nothing wrong with that, but it is a really important kind of kickoff to the NFL draft process. So it's a week-long showcase and for the top NFL draft prospects who have completed an undergraduate degree. Now, Senior Bowl, that name might throw you off a little bit. You don't actually have to have played 4 years of college to qualify for the bowl. It's a newer rule. Within the last decade, I believe they made that switch. But you do have to have completed your undergraduate degree. So if you were a junior, you played 3 years, and you were able to get your degree in those 3 years, then you are eligible for the Senior Bowl. So that's just a quick note there. There's a lot of stuff that happens over the course of the week. Players weigh in. That's really important. You get those measurables for the first time. They compete in one-on-one drills in practice. I referred to that a little bit earlier. Those isolation-type activities really help, especially we're going to talk about some of these small school guys. It can be difficult sometimes you flip on the tape for a small school guy, right? Like Austin Watkins at a UAB, University of Alabama, Birmingham. We're going to talk about him. He looks really fast on tape. He looks like he's got a good first step on tape. How does that line up when you put him against some of the top corners in the draft? Does he hold up? And if he does, his draft stock is going to rise. We'll break that down a little bit more here in a minute, but I want to just draw an example. At the end of the week, they actually play a football game. Now, kind of the joke for folks who are a little bit more honed in on the draft is that most folks who actually go down to cover the game, even some scouts, they're gone by the time the game happens. The meat and potatoes is really at the beginning of the week. It's the practices, it's the weigh-ins, and it's starting to get an idea of the character of players as scouts and media are around them. Now, the Senior Bowl is considered the premier showcase game, but there's also other games out there. The East-West Shrine Bowl is a big one. The NFLPA Bowl is the big one. So there's more, and there's more bowls, by the way, going down the line, but I would say those are the 3 biggest ones. Important thing to talk about here. Players are invited based on the interest from NFL teams. So Jim Nagy, the director of the Senior Bowl, when he invites a player to come down and play, he is responding to the direct needs and requests of what he's hearing from the NFL, talking directly to those front office guys. So if a player is down in Mobile, they need to be on our radar. I don't care how low that you are. I don't care if you watch his tape and you're like, what in the heck is going on? And trust me, there are some guys where I'm like, what in the heck is going on with this guy's tape? But he's down in Mobile. You got to pay attention. They got to be at least on your radar because that tells me that the NFL is interested in them. And I think I'm a good evaluator. I love watching tape. I'm not an NFL evaluator. All right, I'm not. So I'm going to defer to what they're telling me when they're giving me these obvious signals that a player is worth consideration. Some examples of some guys who in the past have gotten a major bump from the Senior Bowl. Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield was not going to be the number 1 overall pick before Mobile. The Browns were down there. The Browns fell in love with him, jumped up the draft board. Josh Allen, being from a small school, Wyoming, that was really helpful for him. Dak Prescott, that was helpful. And Dak Prescott was a day 2 quarterback, remember, but that helped him. Carson Wentz, North Dakota State, that helped him. David Johnson out of Northern Iowa, big bump after the Senior Bowl. How about Antonio Gibson from last year? We got to see a little bit more of what Antonio Gibson could do outside of his scheme. Because remember, Antonio Gibson was not asked to run the ball a whole lot because of Kenny Gainwell at Memphis. So at the Senior Bowl, coaching staffs are able to use them however the heck that they want to, right? So that kind of stuff is helpful. Kareem Hunt, Terry McLaurin, DJ Chark, we could keep naming down names. Guys get bumps from coming to the Senior Bowl. It's the kickoff of the NFL draft process. And if you start to build some momentum right off the bat, that momentum carries through with front offices, with scouts, with analysts. That momentum carries through and pushes you up the draft board by the time we get to April and the NFL draft is occurring. All right, we got the background in now, and I got 10 guys to talk about. So we're going to start working through. We're going to start building this big board. I'm really excited to do it, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to start here with one of my favorite players from the draft. I think he's underrated, really under the radar. That's Kylen Granson, tight end out of SMU. Now, take that tight end term with a grain of salt. Kylen Granson played the last 2 years of his college career at SMU, but actually before that, he was playing wideout for Rice. And he comes to SMU, and he's super productive. 1,257 receiving yards and 14 touchdowns in just 2 seasons, just 22 games for the Ponies. He's an athletic pass catcher. He's got consistent hands. He's currently 45 overall on my big board and tight end 3 on the rookie big board. Now he's 6'3", 235. So he might be used as a hybrid wide receiver tight end by a team. he might be pigeonholed into an H-back role, in which case we're going to pivot hard off of him. But for now, I'm projecting him out to be an athletic pass-catching tight end. And at 6'3", 235, I really like that size in today's NFL. So I like Kylen Granson a lot. He's one of my most fun tape reviews. I'm not somebody who is often going to come on here and get excited about a tight end. I got to be honest with you. There's one tight end on the big board today. It's Kylen Granson. He's coming in at 10. But for fantasy football, we know where we need to dig, right? We need to dig sometimes to find that tight end talent. Coming in at number 9 here on the big board is Larry Rountree III. Now, Larry Rountree, he's a guy you're going to hear me talk about a lot. You might get sick of me talking about Larry Rountree. And at some point, his hype will cap because I think there's only so far. I think he's a day 3 guy. But I think he's a really good day 3 guy. And I think he's one that we are not quite talking enough about. A 4-year starter from Mizzou. You could stop there, and that would be something to pay attention to. A 4-year starter in the SEC at the running back position. That's impressive. 3,720 career rushing yards and 40 TDs. Larry Rountree III is the 17th all-time rusher in terms of rushing yards and rushing touchdowns in the SEC. That is not an easy mark to get to. Now, in terms of his tape, he's a well-rounded back. He's got good strength. He's got good contact balance. He's got good vision. You're hearing me use the word good a lot. He doesn't have elite traits. He's not super fantastic or above the class at any particular one thing, but he's good at a lot of things. And at some positions, that's not that exciting. But at the running back position and the way the NFL works, how many fantasy football guys end up being relevant as second, third, fourth string running backs, and all of a sudden they're fantasy football relevant because we know the way depth charts get chopped down? Well, if you have a reliable back like Larry Rountree as an option on your depth chart as an NFL team, he's going to see time. And so for me as a fantasy football player, Roundtree right now, he's in the 40s on my big board. He's probably going to go in the 4th round of your rookie leagues. But he's still somebody that I really want to pay attention to. And I think Mobile is an opportunity where that draft stock and that draft momentum is going to rise. I can already tell you with my ear on the ground, I'm hearing some swell and some momentum for Larry Rountree, at least in terms of what the NFL appreciates and what they're looking for. And so I think the Senior Bowl is only going to help Larry Rountree build some momentum. So go ahead and jump on the Rountree train now and just save yourself some time. Moving up next here, we have Shai Smith, the wide receiver out of the real USC, University of South Carolina. I get into some trouble when I drop that line, but I like to point out that South Carolina is the real USC. 5'10", 190. Listen, Shai Smith is not somebody who is major league hyped. He's not somebody who's out there being really talked about a good deal. And I got to tell you, even as somebody that really digs into the Devy side of things, I had heard Shai Smith's name. He's only ever had okay production, so I was never that hype on him. But he first caught my eye when the Vols were playing South Carolina this year, and he was just scooping up everything underneath. So I made a point to really flip on and watch USC, South Carolina, specifically to watch Shai Smith, and what I saw was really consistent hands throughout the season. He's going to be a reliable underneath target PPR guy. If you're playing in a full PPR league, then Shai Smith is on your late round radar. It's going to be a day 3 guy, all right? He's going to go later in the NFL draft, but he's got that PPR upside, and we've seen how that could be flat. Julian Edelman, a best case scenario, right? Julian Edelman, Emmanuel Sanders. You don't always have to be the most flashy type guy. Golden Tate, some of these guys, and I'm not comparing play styles necessarily. Those aren't direct comps, but similar approaches to how they can help your fantasy football team. Now, Shai Smith, 633 yards, 57 receptions, 4 touchdowns in 9 games. That's 5th most receptions this season in the SEC. And I love the Gamecocks, y'all. They're one of the teams that I appreciate out of the SEC East. That offense was broken this year. All right, so for Shai Smith to pull in 57 receptions and be 5th in the SEC in receptions on a broken offense, that's pretty impressive. Now, we've seen the lineage coming out of South Carolina the last couple of years. And I'm not somebody who's going to tell you to scout the helmet. I never do. But NFL teams are going to pay attention to the fact that we've gotten some good talent coming out of South Carolina the last couple of years. And they're going to be paying attention, and I'll be paying attention because I really like Shai Smith, the wide receiver out of the University of South Carolina. Moving on to number 7 here, Michael Carter. He's the forgotten about running back for the University of North Carolina. If you're listening into my NFL Draft Bible Podcast Network show, Draft Seminar with John Lobb, you would have heard us gushing about Michael Carter. We just did the Senior Bowl running back previews. You would have heard me gushing about Michael Carter. 5'8", 199, not the biggest guy, but he knows how to use his size. He's got that low center of gravity. It leads to tremendous contact balance. At times, he puts defenders on skates with his athleticism. He's got this really nice juke move, solid vision, solid burst. Again, not going to blow away, not going to be the top guy. But everyone's falling in love with Javonte Williams, and that's fine. Javonte Williams is a good prospect. I talked about him on the first episode of the Rookie Big Board. He's running back 4 for me on the big board. I'm not hating on Javonte Williams, but what I do want to point out is that Michael Carter outrushed Javonte Williams by 100 yards in 2020 on one less carry. So let's not ignore Michael Carter just because we're in love with Javonte Williams. We don't got to pick. We don't have to pick one or the other. We can like them both. And Michael Carter, I think, is a guy who's going to go down to Mobile. We're going to see him work on his own. We're going to see him in the spotlight of just him. And I think we're going to fall in love. And I think NFL teams are going to fall in love. Now, Michael Carter, if we're going to tie it back to Justin's question, that Patreon question that powers this podcast, and I know this isn't like the most exciting thing for fantasy football, but couldn't you see Michael Carter with CMC and Carter getting 8 to 12 touches a game? And then what happens if CMC misses time again? That's the type of upside we're looking for with Michael Carter. All right, you knew we had to get to a quarterback, right? You knew a quarterback was coming, and it's got to be Kyle Trask. We got to talk about Kyle Trask. And one of the things, I will always be honest about the flaws and challenges I see in a player's draft stock. I always will be. But one of the things I want to be really intentional about with this podcast is focusing on the positives, right? The upside of players, their fantasy football appeal, but being realistic about it. All right, I'm not going to hype guys up just to hype them up. Kyle Trask has a lot on the line at the Senior Bowl. All right, so if you're not familiar with the Kyle Trask story, it goes all the way back to high school. But in 2019, he took over for an injured Felipe Franks. Now the quarterback at Arkansas. By the way, Felipe Franks is not on the big board. Felipe Franks will be at the Senior Bowl. And when I was talking about players, when you watch their tape and you're like, why in the heck did they get an invite to Mobile, but I still have to pay attention anyways because the NFL told me they're interested? Yeah, I was talking about Felipe Franks. But anyways, Kyle Trask takes over for Felipe Franks after he gets injured, playing at Florida. That first game, when Kyle Trask took over, was the first time he had started a game since the freshman year of high school. So I know you're asking yourself, how in the heck does a quarterback get to Florida on scholarship, stick on the team for 2 years, and he hadn't started a game since high school? Okay, well, there's a good reason. The quarterback he lost the job to in high school, De'Aaron King. Now at Miami, spent a lot of time at Houston originally. So there's some validity there, and clearly Florida liked what they saw from him and kept him around, not just to make the team, but to stay with the team. Shows a lot of resilience mentally from Kyle Trask. In terms of his tape, he's got a big arm. At times, there's flashes of touch, and there's flashes of anticipation, and there's flashes of very improved accuracy from his 2019 tape. And it really can hook you in on Kyle Trask. I understand why people are excited about Kyle Trask, and he's my QB5 on the big board. And I feel good about him at QB5 on the big board. I don't think he's a day one guy. And I know some people do. I don't. Now, he could go day one. Jordan Love went day one. Once Jordan Love went day one, I throw out the idea that quarterbacks can't go day one. But I don't think that Kyle Trask will go day one. Here's the reason why. And here's the reason why Mobile is going to be so critical for Kyle Trask. His stock could shoot up. His stock could drop down. The reason is because Dan Mullins is a dang good play caller. He's a good offensive coordinator. He's the head coach there, but he's good at coordinating the offense. And he is a QB guru. And why is he a QB guru? Because he knows how to hide a quarterback's flaws. Trask struggled in 2019 throwing to the mid and deep field. Kyle Trask did not often throw to the mid and deep field unless it was set up for him. And when he was throwing to Kyle Pitts. He was throwing to Kadarius Toney. He was throwing to Trayvon Grimes. And I am not knocking him for that. Take advantage of your weapons. Do what you got to do. You made a run at the Heisman. You fell apart at the end, but you made a run at the Heisman. The question is, what does he do without those guys? What does he do as the headlining quarterback at the Senior Bowl? Kyle Trask is probably the biggest name quarterback at the Senior Bowl. What does he do on his own? That week of practice is going to make his stock for NFL teams or break his stock for NFL teams. So Kyle Trask is a quarterback that I'm really going to be paying attention to because I will be honest, I'm critical of him. I'm not all out on him, but I'm critical of him. But he has the chance to really prove me wrong in any NFL team that's not in on him. All right, moving on to number 5 here on the big board. This is a guy I'm excited about. This is a guy that I get really fired up about. I think he's flying under the radar. These are the types of values that I hope you listen to this podcast for. These are the types of guys that have high potential. You can take them in the 3rd or 4th round of your fantasy drafts. If they miss, they miss. I don't hit 100%. I don't hit 100%. I'm sorry, I don't. You don't either. I hope if you do, hit me up because I want to pick your brain if you're hitting 100%. But here's a guy who could hit. It's Austin Watkins Jr., the wide receiver out of the University of Alabama, Birmingham, UAB, the Blazers. Mid-round sleeper steal potential. Putting that stamp on him now. Austin Watkins Jr., mid-round sleeper steal potential. 6'2", 205. If you recognize the last name, he is the cousin of Sammy Watkins. Now he's a twitchy athlete, moves really well east to west and north to south. He's got consistent hands, dangerous in space. He breaks off a mean slant route. I got to tell you, it's always good to recognize the things that maybe you get too excited about as a scout. For some reason, I love a wide receiver that can break a slant. If you can break a man on a slant, you could get away with a lot in the NFL. One of the reasons I fell in love with A.J. Brown. I loved A.J. Brown as a prospect. And it's because he could break that slant, and he's still doing it. There are some routes that just work in the NFL. And you can isolate guys and get them in a situation where they could just break slants on defenders all day, especially if they have the speed to get that DB to take just one step back off the line of scrimmage. And Watkins does have that upside and that speed too. Now, he's not a complete burner. He's quicker than he's fast, but he can speed up. So I like Austin Watkins a lot. Now in 2020, just 7 games, 466 yards, 3 touchdowns. That doesn't really get you too excited. Well, how about the 2019 numbers? Remember, full season, 1,092 receiving yards in 6 touchdowns in 2019, 19.2 receptions, yards per reception. 19.2 yards per reception for Austin Watkins Jr. in 2019. There's a lot to like here. I think he's a guy, has a good showing in Mobile, can go from a day 3 guy to a day 2 guy. Day 2 is loaded with wide receivers. It's a stacked wide receiver class. We know that. And a lot of other folks, a lot of your league mates, right? What are they doing right now? They're picking apart Devontae Smith. They're figuring out Rashad Bateman should be a first-round guy. They're spending their time on Jalen Waddle, and those things are all valid. But that's not what we're doing here. We're digging deeper. And so while folks spend 3 months deciding whether they want Devonta Smith or Jalen Waddle just to change their mind once they get drafted, we're digging deep, and we're finding the values in Austin Watkins Jr., that upside, that potential that we really get excited about. Nobody says upside and potential more than Ramadre Stevenson, but there is a floor, man. Low floor, high ceiling. We're playing roulette right now with Ramadre Stevenson, the running back out of Oklahoma. But I've noticed a narrative out there that we're not playing roulette. There's this real hype that he is maybe a little bit more of a sure thing than he is. So let me give you the background on Rhamondre Stevenson. Transferred to Oklahoma University. He was originally at Cerritos JUCO, junior college. And when he came in, he gave the Oklahoma team a big bump. Now in 6 games, just the second half of the season, and we'll get to why he only played the second half of the season. But in just the second half of the season in 2020, 6 games, 655 yards, 7 touchdowns. powerful downhill runner. At times, he embarrasses Big 12 linebackers because he literally flicks them off of them. He's 6'0", 246 pounds, and he is a running back. 6'0", 246, throwing guys off of him, playing in the Big 12. I mean, he looks like Derrick Henry out there playing against high school kids at times. So I understand why we're getting excited about Ramadre Stevenson. We need to see him in these drills. We need to see him throughout the week at practice. And I think he can gain some momentum. But remember I talked about earlier those character, getting those coaches to trust you, get to know you, getting those scouts, making an impression in front of those scouts. That's what Rhamondre Stevenson needs to do. His off-the-field performance is going to be just as important as his on-the-field performance in Mobile. He was suspended 6 games because he tested positive for, or I guess I should say he failed the drug test leading up to the 2019 Peach Bowl game. So he missed the Peach Bowl game. He missed the first 5 games of 2020. And that's after not really having a large sample size because he transferred from JUCO. So I think there's going to be a lot of question marks around Rhamondre Stevenson. That's a player who I'm going to be watching in real closely. Here's another player I'm going to be watching in really closely. It's Demetric Felton out of UCLA. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see that as I'm building this big board and the graphics are popping up, I list each player by position. And if you're familiar with the big board, you know that this year you'll actually see that some players are listed as athletes in my rookie big board. I took that from the way that we scout high school kids coming into college. Sometimes they're athletes because we're not really sure how, different colleges could use them in different ways. And I'm going to do that same thing here when it comes to Demetric Felton. And there's some other guys in the class and on the big board, as you'll see, for those with access to it. Again, that $3 level of patron support. But for Demetric Felton, it's a really interesting situation. And I think what the Senior Bowl is going to help us do is understand how the NFL can and wants to use him. 5'10", 200. Now, in 2019, he primarily played wideout. He had 55 receptions for the Bruins at UCLA, 86 rushing attempts. So he definitely did both, but he was lined up out wide more often than he was actually in the backfield for UCLA. Now, there's a very good reason why, as I'm sure a lot of draft Twitter is familiar with. Joshua Kelly came out of UCLA, and Joshua Kelly was a highly productive back for the Bruins. It makes sense they didn't really want to move him off the field all too often. But in 2020, when Joshua Kelly was gone, then Demetric Felton took over. 132 rushing attempts, for 668 yards and 5 touchdowns, along with 22 receptions. Now remember, everyone's season was shortened to a degree. UCLA's season was shortened. Pac-12 played 5 games. So those are pretty good numbers. And that's a pretty good usage rate. He's athletic. He's twitchy. He's elusive in space. In the right landing spot, Demetric Felton has some of the highest upside in this draft class for fantasy football purposes. He's somebody I'm really excited about. And I'm really excited to see how they want to use him in Mobile because it's going to start giving us an idea of how he's going to be used in the NFL. We're building momentum. We're all the way up to 2 on the big board. And we got a big guy coming in here at 6'4", 222. It's Nico Collins out of the University of Michigan. Now, you may have forgotten about Nico Collins because he opted out of the 2020 season for the Wolverines. One thing to pay attention to with this wide receiver class, there's not a ton of height. I know that sounds weird, but we're kind of used to the past couple of years having those guys that we fall in love with at 6'4", 6'5". Terrace Marshall is probably the lengthiest big-name guy at 6'3". It's one of the reasons I like Terrace Marshall. So I think he offers something that not a lot of the rest of the class does. But Nico Collins falls into that same category of being a big guy with good length. 6'4", 222. Now, he was highly touted coming out of high school, highly ranked 4-star prospect. He came to Michigan with big hype. Now, that production, that hype, it never came to fruition. It's a rough offense for wide receivers to produce in. Remember, we like Donovan Peoples-Jones a lot? And he flashed a little bit for the Browns this year. At times, Donovan Peoples-Jones looked really good. Well, Nico Collins, he was able to get 1,361 yards and 75 receptions in 2 seasons. catching balls from Shea Patterson primarily, so you got to give him a little bit of a break there. But he opted out of the 2020 season. He made an intentional decision that his draft stock would be best suited by spending that time training on his own and getting ready for the draft process instead of playing at Michigan. And I'm not knocking anybody for their decision. It's a difficult decision. I don't know what I would have done in the situation. I certainly will never have to worry about it. Trust me. I've never gotten, close to that level of athleticism. But this was the decision that Nico Collins made, which means he should be one of the most prepared guys for this draft process, right? So will he come through in his time to shine? Was it the smart move to spend the season training instead of playing at the Senior Bowl? And he's not the only one in this boat. Number one on the big board is a guy we're going to talk about in a similar vein, but this is going to be a consistent theme that's going to be talked about. And we're not going to know the answer really until draft night, until the draft weekend's done and we see how draft stock has moved around. But until then, we're projecting, and it's going to start here at the Senior Bowl, and it's going to start with guys like Nico Collins. I'm really excited that he's at the Senior Bowl because he's somebody who's carrying over on a lot of Devy rosters for me. I bought in on his athleticism, his contested catch ability, his speed, and matching all that with his size. Now, he's got inconsistent hands. He doesn't have a great release off the line of scrimmage. So there's red flags, but I bought in low on Nico Collins in a lot of spots. And Mobile is where I'm going to start seeing if that was a good decision or not. Number one on the big board, if you're familiar with my work, you knew it was coming. It's Jamie Newman. It's Jamie Newman, the quarterback out of Wake Forest, Georgia. I guess technically out of both. I'm really considering him to be a Wake Forest quarterback. But this is the guy that I have been waiting to see. Now, if you're not familiar with Jamie Newman, 6'4", 230, true dual threat quarterback. And if you know me and you're playing in Superflex leagues like I am, there is nothing that will perk your ears up more than the dual threat quarterback. And that's Jamie Newman. Now, he's not a surefire prospect by any means, but he gained a lot of hype after the 2019 season. He had a fairly productive run at college. He can push the ball downfield. He can throw the ball really 50 yards downfield without too much effort. Just really good arm. At times, he leads his wideouts very well. At times, he does not. That's inconsistent. He has really good pocket presence, pocket awareness, which I really appreciate from a running quarterback because he's not instantly going to choose run. He can scramble when plays are broken down, but he has good pocket presence and he can throw the ball. So he's not limited to just being a running quarterback by any means. But when he does run, he can execute a design run very well. Like I said, he can work a breakdown as well. He breaks defenders in space. He's got sharp moves, and he's also not afraid to lower his shoulder and scrap out extra yards. And I know that's not something that we love for an NFL quarterback, but it works for Josh Allen, right? And so it can work. It can work. But here's where the controversy, maybe, the desire to see more. I mentioned his tape wasn't perfect, and it was not perfect. Mental side of the game, errors. Accuracy, errors, inconsistent. He transfers to Georgia, which is a really graduate transfer to Georgia. Finishes his degree with the Deacon Demons, transfers to Georgia. We are so excited to see what he can be in an SEC offense, an offense that likes to run the ball a lot. So I thought Jamie Newman was going to be able to really execute in that offense. About a month before the season starts, I want to say, decides to opt out of the season. And again, I don't blame anybody for opting out, but it was a really tough thing for us to absorb as evaluators because I think we needed that final year. We needed a year of Jamie Newman against SEC defenses to see if he could be a first-round guy, which I originally thought he was a first-round guy in this draft class. Right now, he's a mid to late day 2 projection for me. And I think with a good Senior Bowl, with a good draft process, I think an NFL team could fall in love with him in the back end of the first round. I'm not saying he's a first-round guy. I'm not saying he's a day 1 guy. I think he's probably locked in as a day 2 talent. But I think the NFL is seeing what's working right now with guys like Josh Allen, with guys like Pat Mahomes who have those improvised arm angles, with guys like Lamar Jackson who can run those executed design runs. And Jamie Newman isn't any of those players. Those aren't direct comps. But I'm telling you, the NFL, they latch onto what works, and that's working right now. Right? Who's in the playoffs in the AFC? All those quarterbacks I just named. So it's working, and I could see an NFL team falling in love with Jamie Newman, but he's got to show up, and he's got to be perfect. He's got to be the best quarterback in the room every single day, from Mobile to Indianapolis at the Combine, all the way to draft night, which will be virtual or in Cleveland. But he's got to be the best guy in the room. But if he is, and he's got the potential to be, he really does. I think he's got huge upside. If he lives up to that, then I think he will be the biggest riser from the Senior Bowl. That is my Senior Bowl big board. I'm going to read it back here. It's Kylen Granson, the athletic pass-catching tight end at SMU, coming in at 10. Coming in at 9, Larry Rountree, versatile, well-rounded running back out of the University of Missouri. Shai Smith, wide receiver out of the University of South Carolina. PPR underneath, consistent hand threat. Michael Carter, running back out of UNC. Think he could be a really good backfield mate or do it on his own if he has to in the NFL. Kyle Trask, the highly divisive, highly polarizing quarterback prospect out of Florida. What can he do without Dan Mullins protecting him at the Senior Bowl? Austin Watkins Jr., our mid-round sleeper, athletic, twitchy wide receiver. Rhamondre Stevenson, high ceiling, low floor for the powerful back out of Oklahoma. Demetric Felton, the athletic, versatile running back / wide receiver athlete out of UCLA. Nico Collins, the wide receiver out of Michigan with high hype, who chose to opt out of the 2020 season. And Jamie Newman, the quarterback out of Wake Forest / University of Georgia, coming in at number 1 on the rookie big board. And there it is. I appreciate you joining me for episode 2 of the Rookie Big Board podcast. Please subscribe and leave a 5-star rating and a review. I got to tell y'all, I read all of the reviews. I appreciate them so much. I truly do. So thank you for leaving those reviews. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, give it a thumbs up, tell a friend, tell a league mate. I know you don't want to tell your league mates. Tell them, tell a friend, tell your family member, tell everybody. We're going to grow this podcast. And like I said, I was blown away with the listenership and the watches the first time around. So I thank you for that. Help me grow it. And join the community on Patreon to get access to the bonus episode where I'll be breaking down individual components of the Senior Bowl, the biggest components, the things that we should be paying the most attention to. And I'll be ranking and building a big board as an extension of this conversation. You also get access to the Slack channel, access to the big board, the dynasty rankings, the Devy rankings, and of course, the 2021 rookie big board, where you can see how all of these players compare to the rest of the class. You see my NFL draft projections for them. You see my rookie draft projections.